Hello YouTube and the scooter community. Today I want to explain how bearings work, I want to explain how bearing spacers work, and the wheel itself. I've watched a few videos recently and it made me think of this video. I think it was Max Peters. He was talking about how to dial your scooter wheels and everything else about your scooter, and obviously I've watched some Scooter Zone videos in the past and recently about how to fix certain things about your wheels, but none of them covered about bearing spacers and how important they are. This can be in skateboarding, inlining, any sports that use these types of wheels. In fact, even this one is actually a racing wheel for rollerblades. But that's another story. Well, first I'll start with explaining a bearing. If you've ever seen the inside of a bearing or the construction of a bearing like this, there's the outer ring. So you've got this outer ring here. You've got the inner ring, which is just there, and then you have the ball bearings in the middle spinning there, and then there's obviously a little plastic cage around it. They can come in metal as well. They're just there to kind of keep all the bearings in line and in place, because if they weren't in place it wouldn't stay together. Now on the insides of these rings, or on the outside of the inner ring and the inside of the outer ring, there's a little groove, and I can show you that on this example here of the inner ring. Now this keeps the bearings in and they're pressed together, all aligned, etc. And once they're in there, they're not going to come out unless user fault or they wear down and they just fall out. But that's how the bearing is constructed. Now I'll discuss how bearings actually compress. So I'll focus here, move this all out of the way. So just imagine that is how the bearing is fitting in the wheel. So you have a little gap in the middle, and when you tighten it with a bolt and some spacers on either side, basically the inner part of the bearing will move in, because the outer part is being restricted. It's being, the inner part is being pulled out a little bit, and I'll tell you how this happens. In the inside of a wheel, you can see there's a little inner part that's a bit smaller, and that lip is where the bearing sits. So once you push a bearing in, I'll use a different wheel for an example. So you see there's a little ridge in this one as well. In all scooter wheels, inline wheels, skateboard wheels, there's normally a little ledge for it to sit on. So once you push it in, it doesn't go any further, it doesn't go right through. It sits on that little lip, as you can see there. And basically these bearing spacers fit in that space before fitting another bearing in. And what this prevents is that the inner part of the wheel doesn't come too far, because the outer ring is being supported by that little lip, and then the inner part of the bearing will pull in when you tighten your bolt or axle, if that's preferred. So once you've tightened your wheel, the inner parts of the bearings will push in together, and even if you don't have a spacer, it'll even just keep going until your wheel doesn't spin, or until you actually pop the bearing out of place. You can put enough force that the inner part of the bearing will pop out, and you'll see ball bearings roll everywhere. So that's the importance of bearing spacers. Now you can't just whack any old one in there. There is a technique to it. If you have one too large, there's not going to be support on the horizontal, the inner part of the wheel, or the vertical axis. There's just not going to be enough support, because it won't even touch the vertical axis of the wheel, because that vertical axis is right on that lip. Oh no. But yeah, if you have a bearing spacer that's too big, you can tell by these are the older types of ones. You can get different ones. You can get ones that align selfily, but for this demonstration I'll use the older type just to show you. So you can see this bearing space is too big because it's taller than that lip when there's a bearing inside, just one side. When it's too big, I'll get a better example actually, just to show you more clearly. So you see that bearing space is way too big. So if I was to put a bearing in the other side, so that's hit that bearing spacer now, and if it's too big, it pushes right through. You see how that happened when I pushed on the other side? It pushed the bearing out like that. But yeah, that's only supported on the horizontal axis. So eventually that will cause ovalizing of the wheel. Ovalizing is where the inner part of the wheel becomes not a perfect fit for a bearing. It's not circular, it becomes ovalized. It's kind of in the name there. So what you want to do is find a bearing spacer that's the same size as the lip inside the wheel. At least that. If you like your bearings to run a bit freely, you want it at least the same size as the lip inside the wheel. At least that. Never bigger. Never go bigger, because again you'll get ovalized wheels. Yeah, I'll show you. I'll push a bearing in. So I'm going to show you how to find the perfect spacer. So this one we saw earlier is probably just a tiny bit too big, tiny bit too tall. I think this is the one I used. Yep, that's a perfect fit. So that's the same size as the lip of the inside of the wheel. So that will prevent my bearings pulling in too much, but it won't stop it by pulling in at least a tiny bit. If anything, if you like your wheels to be a bit tighter, get a smaller spacer. You can do this by just filing the spacer down with a metal file. That's what I've done with this one. You can kind of see where I've filed it down. But that's how you would get a perfect size spacer, because it also helps keeping your axle tight. Because if you don't have a spacer and you just tighten it until it spins nice, the problem with that is that the bolt will come loose eventually, because it's not really locked against something. You know, if you ever locked two nuts on a bolt, they stay there. They're so hard to get undone. It's the same principle with this. If there's not metal for it to hit, or there's nothing. That's why you can pull the bearings out of these without a spacer. There's that much pressure on it. So if there's something in the middle to meet, it supports it 10 times better. So you definitely want to have a spacer in there that's just the right size. So if you want your wheel a bit tighter, have a slightly smaller spacer. I'm meaning these are like less than millimeters. You'll be able to see it. There's definitely a noticeable difference. This is why I prefer using these spacers, is because I can see how tall they are, because I can put it right up against the lip of the wheel and see whereabouts it needs to be. With these ones, it's kind of a tricky situation because they're right in the middle. It's kind of hard to judge. Most days when you buy wheels, they come with bearings and spacers fitted. They're normally pretty good. They're not bad, but there are some times where the spacer's the wrong size. It's slightly too big and your wheel ovalizes. But very rare chance for that happening now. But that's how I get it, is I file down the spacer until it fits. And basically what I look for is, once I push the bearings in with the spacer, there should be a very little rattle. Rattling it side to side, you should hear a little rattle. That's what I look for in a bearing spacer, because that means that when I tighten my wheel, these inner parts of the bearings will push against it just a little bit, and then it will lock in place. And it means that my wheel will not spin really fast, but enough. That's just my preference. I like it to be a little bit tighter than usual, just to get that dialed feeling. If you want your scooter to sound like a basketball, do this method and it will work every single time. I'll show you the kind of spin you want to look for as well. So once you put your axle in, that's the only tricky part about these spacers is, it's hard to align. The best way is just to stick an Allen key in there and wriggle it about until the axle pops through. So I'm just going to use an example here. Just imagine this is going on a scooter fork or a scooter deck. And basically you tighten it down. Even finger tight is locked enough, but you can lock it much more. And basically when you spin your wheel, it should spin and then come to a nice halt. That's what I look for when I find a spacer. So once you get that, it's perfect. Like I said earlier, a lot of metal cores now come with bearings fitted, etc. And it's definitely a lot nicer than way before in the past. With plastic cores, it's a bit different. Especially if you have plastic cores, you'll need some shorter spacers. Just for the fact that it's metal against plastic, there's going to be a lot. It's going to break the plastic eventually. That's what these things are renowned for. But that's how I dialed these things. Plastic cores are not the best wheel. I advise getting metal cores and just doing that technique, and you'll be set. Yeah, that's how you dial a scooter wheel properly. As I said before, there's not many people who've actually talked about bearing spacers much, and I feel like I'm the only one who's done it. But these little fellas, they are an important step in dialing your scooter. So if you want to dial your scooter, please listen to my advice, or at least try it, because it will work. I've done it so many times. It's what I've used over 10 years of my life. I know it works. But yeah, like I said, not many other videos talk about bearing spacers at all. So if you know another video that talks about them, please link it. I'm not here for exposure. I just want to expose this topic a bit more so people understand them. If you like a video like this, please comment below. Link another video that's like this. If anyone else has spoken about it, please suggest it, because not enough people know about the beauty of these little fellas. They're kind of left out a little bit, I think. But yeah, please share this topic. Smash the like button if you actually learn anything. Sorry if I didn't explain it properly. Yeah, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in a bit.